Righty. So, week 9 Learn Together is upon us, and it's making me really think about, and therefore you're going to think about your next develop it. And what I'm going to do today is go over an example code that I've done that implements the ideas, the concepts, and then we'll go over those as we get there. And so, what I'm going to do is go ahead and open DevOne requirements. I did make some minor changes today. So we'll just kind of go over this kind of line by line maybe, and I'll show you my output. First, so get input from the user. And I have here at least two types of input in the browser, right? So I want to show you, so not a big surprise based on my code example for dev 0, is I've taken my rock, scissors, paper into the browser. I've added some functionality to it, which is part of what we're doing here. And so the first thing you'll see is I have a inner username. Now, this is not authentication. This is kind of pre-thinking way authentication might work, but it's just a simple way for me to implement the idea of getting a player without doing a full setting up an account and doing all that, which you will learn. You may have already know, but you will learn later. So that's one input. So my other inputs are actually each image. So each image actually has an event listener on it so that it can respond to the user. So in this case, I want to show you that user input could either be an input box or an image. Even though Andrew doesn't show an image, it's perfectly fine to use them. Matter of fact, from a user perspective, depending on what you're doing, it might make a lot of sense. So I just want you to know when you read that, you can expand your thinking a little bit, which I would, because remember what you're doing is implementing something in the browser. So we have to think about the user. Like I wouldn't necessarily want the user to input into the box, which is fine, but this seems more intuitive, which we know an image speaks 1,000 words, speaks volumes. So just giving you that example. So the first thing, and this is another thing Andrew didn't quite handle, that I'm at least going to give you an example today. So one thing I do is if they try to click on an item or one of the selectors of rock, scissors, paper, I give them a message. It says, hey, can you read, enter? And I was being a little playful here, a little snarky, which is fine to be snarky, right? So this is really for our own projects. If we were doing projects related to wanting to add to our portfolio, we'd want them to be a little more business focused, or at least maybe not as snarky. So in this case, I go ahead and say, hey, right, can you read? And so what I do then is I listen for input in the field and then I clear that message. So that's one fairly easy way you can look at this, which by the way, I'm going to give you this code so you can review. So if I give a username, right, cool, and I hit tab, what's nice here is what it does is it responds to that by telling who's using it, or the player is now playing, right? And it also gives us this like, which I'll come back and talk about in a minute. But also down here, it says no player game history found, right? So this is part of what maybe down here has meaningful output, right? So you want whatever you're doing, let me go back, to actually have meaningful output to the user. It doesn't have to be really elaborate, just has to be meaningful. Right? So in this case now, right, I can go ahead and click, right? So now I actually get some nice output showing the results of, rock beats paper, so the player wins. It also gives me a nice little history here. So I have total games played, total wins, total losses, and I get the actual detail. Now in this case, you would think about gameplay. You wouldn't want the user to be able to delete a game. So I decided that I would just show this here just for an example of because remember what we saw in the Notes app, right? So in this case, I can either look at the detail, which is it's similar to what you're going to learn with Andrew this week in the edit page, right? So I give them the output, but I don't do any edits because that wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense to allow them to edit the game, but they do need to see it. And actually, I just realized I need to fix that, and I know actually how to fix that. And you will learn how to fix that is the way you send them back from the edit page, and you'll see how so this is good because what I'm doing is realizing there was a couple of things in my code I needed to fix. So if I hit tab again, oh, actually interesting. I actually don't account. Actually, let's do it. Where is the actual player? Okay. So what it does is, and because it's storing it in local storage over here, right? And you can see what I'm storing is that it keeps that player name. It keeps that because it's keeping it by storing it in local storage. And then you can see here what I have in local storage. And you're going to learn about that, in this week, which is the UUID. But then really how to just write the code to place this into local storage. Now, I want to stop here and say the following, and I just want you to know there's definitely some thinking, and I'm going to give a link to this article because I think it's worth looking at. Written, a little over a year ago. Well, actually, it'd be yeah. So there's some people, so we're really using local storage to do these CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. So I want you to get used to this idea of thinking about CRUD operations. And I know I'm diverting a little bit here, but I want to give you a link to this because really on any kind of serious application, we probably wouldn't be doing we wouldn't be using local storage for what we're using it for in this example, right? I would be storing this out in some kind of web-based database platform like maybe MongoDB or Firebase is great for this as well. Amazon has some great services. So I just want you to know we're really doing this here to give you a gentle introduction to CRUD, okay? CRUD operations. Have you heard this term, CRUD? So CRUD operations, and you're going to hear this many times in this industry, right? So create, read, update, and delete. And what you're doing this week in Andrew's Note app and his To-Do app is really creating these different CRUD operations. And so you'll be doing the same thing for your dev. But again, before I get too far, I just want you to kind of understand the context here, right? And this article is a little snarky, so I kind of like it as well. But I want you to read through this, right? So because there are some redeeming things that are good about local storage, but then what sucks about local storage. So I just want you to know going in that as you continue your development journey, you will move away from using local storage in lieu of database services, but it's good to learn it now. Okay, so coming back, let's actually go back now, right? So getting input, storing it with the associated dates, right? So that's the other thing you learn is implementing moments.js. And I'm telling you, moments.js, and really, let me come back over here, right? So if you look at, I have a timestamp. And so because JavaScript dates aren't that great to play with or play around with or to do some fun stuff with, implementing, and in this case, all I make you do is store. You could actually store the regular date and time if you don't need it for your particular application, right? But I at least want you to have associated date somehow, UUID. Now, the thing I started thinking about on this one was how much data do you have to store, right? I actually don't say, I thought about saying that today. So you can look at my example and see that I stored the ID, which is UUID, the player name, the result, the player choice, the game choice, and the timestamp, right? So I'm do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of data. So does yours have to be 6? No, but I want it to be, I would say at least 4. So maybe I need to be specific here, but I just wanted to give you the example, right, of thinking about this because I want you to think about, like, for your particular concept, your particular code, what makes sense. So now this next one, give the user the ability to edit their input or something related to their input. And so let me go back to mine. So this is where I start thinking about this. It's like my detail allows them to see the detail, but really I wouldn't want them to update that. And yeah, I'm doing delete, but it's not really, it's only because I want to show you I can do it. It's really up here. I implemented a review. So, like us, question mark, so that the user in this case can say, right, love this game, right? And now, and by the way, this is how you fix this, return to game, right? It actually remembers because it's pulling it off, it's parsing, it's doing a hash on that. And this again is something you learned this week how to do. So for mine, and this is part of why I wrote something related. So you would have that in your head, is that maybe based on your particular app, it might not make sense to give them the ability to edit their input. But if that's not clear, then do something related, right? Process the data and present it back to the user. So in my case, right, this is where just playing the game, like as I'm playing, I'm also looking, say, here's the results of the game, but I'm also updating some history here so that I'm actually having two different kinds of output for my particular user interaction. So I'm reacting to what the user is giving me, right? So I'm not gonna, it's hard to specify because each of us are doing different apps, what that would look like for you. But, you want to think about that. Again, you're the idea of meaningful, but you want to respond to that user output. You want to process it and present it back to the user. Okay. So now here's the part where I'm actually going to do a little work because I don't remember exactly what I did here, but I definitely know some things I want to do. But implement at least two examples of JavaScript code that's not been covered in our course so far, right? So that I'll actually probably cover next. But I just want you to start thinking about this, and actually in your Learn Together, I actually have you start thinking about what this might be, okay, as well. Now, arrow functions are something we're actually going to get introduced to in the following section. But let me just say this, and I want you to have this in your head. Like what you're doing this week is the bulk. The bulk is really what will help you and what you need to implement for our DevOne, which I really in the schedule kind of thought about because section 9, which is next, is really just expanding our knowledge of JavaScript. We're not learning necessarily new things that we'll put in our code, although we could, like truthy values, like ternary operators, but we'll definitely do arrow functions. I want you to have used all arrow functions unless you have a good reason. Right, being able to throw errors. So this is going back to what I said before, where he didn't really give a good example. But in this case, he does show you how to throw errors and how to handle application errors. So we do get some of that in the section before you do that. So in my dev, I was actually thinking about how to maybe word this a little better. Okay. So just kind of giving you my thinking on this. So let's go back here, right? Arrow functions and enemy. Okay, so let me talk about CSS, right? So you want to, in this case, I did spend a little time, as you can see. I did get these images off the web, but I based my CSS around them so that the user could, it's like, well, you tell me if you look at something like this, right? It kind of has a theme to it. It's responding appropriately to the user input. The other thing it's doing, and I don't hard code this into my requirements, but I want you to think about it, is actually being able to do this on a mobile device, right? Up here, I'm looking at it as responsive, but I could look at it like if I was playing this on a mobile phone, it totally worked, right? So the other thing I could do if I was taking this to the next level is I actually probably would make these images even smaller, right? So for this week, I want you to think about, like, do you know how to create responsive sites, right? And there's really this thing called a media query that helps us say at some point, like in my case, when my page gets to about 650, it just stacks those things on top of each other just based on a media query. And that's really the only what I did. But going back here, I didn't specifically say, I just said use CSS for good user experience. But in general, you would want to know how to do that. And hopefully you got that from classes before this. Okay. All right. So the other thing, if you change your topic, I already talked about this. You'll definitely want to look at my style guide. I did update one thing. I will update more. But one thing I added was, like, don't use jQuery or similar projects. Write in pure JS, right? And this is almost a joke, but write in just pure JavaScript. You can leverage libraries, absolutely. Like, we're going to leverage UUID. We're going to leverage, in this case, Moments.js, right? But we're not writing all of our code in that library. We're actually just leveraging that library for specific pieces of functionality. Okay. So one thing I want to show you, so I'm actually going to open up my editor now. And I was just looking at my HTML and see that how I grab my moments. I actually downloaded, and I think there actually, I think, is a link in the course where he talks about downloading UUID. You can also install it from the command line. But more importantly to this is really taking our JS and breaking it out into files that really, even though they're all going to get loaded in the browser, having them broken out and organized in a way really does make sense. And this will probably be something I add to the requirements, right? So in this case, the app, right, is really where we start. And this is where I talked about last week, and you'll see me do this a lot, is when I do document query by ID. I actually only do it once up in the global space so that every time I need it, I can just refer to that variable. I do set up some variables. And then I look for this hash. And I'm not going to go through this in detail because I'm giving you this code, honestly, as part of the reason is just to give you a code example. Notice how there's some comments in here. Like, one of the things, and I actually have something called a to-do markdown of things I'm going to do to this code, is I was looking at it today and realizing, and there's this term called dry, so don't repeat yourself. And I'm noticing on my event listener for my click on my images, see, because paper click, if I come up here, right, is really pointing to that image on the DOM or from the index that points to that image. But I'm really looking at this today and realizing that this code for all three of them is really the same. And there's definitely a way I could write one event listener that would be the same event listener for each, and then grab a unique variable out of the index.html that I could code in for each one. I actually could there's various things like name and other things, and I'm going to look into this, that I could grab that. But again, that's where you refactor. And I'm not saying you have to, I'm just giving you the example. But this is really, the idea of, here's all the things that I need my event listeners, any of my global setups. And Andrew talks about this organization, so I'm just showing you mine. So then you put all of your functions that you need for your code, right, in one file as well. So then you can just load them in. And so, think that when you think about, like, getting the stuff from the items that you've stored in local storage out, probably all of our code is going to look very similar in that case. It's really what we do after we both store it into local storage, right? We save, now in this case, I'm saving the review. So I ended up having another area on local storage. Let me show you this. Where I actually saved the review, right? Instead of, because I wouldn't attach it because this is multiple entries, right? So I didn't, and I used this for my game statistics, so I wouldn't have stored it here. I just set up another local storage area to do that. Okay, so where was I back? Oh yeah, showing you the code. right? So, and then you break out and you'll see this, right? A JS file, and looks like I have a little, that's the other thing is, and I need to be a good example of this, is like, if you have something that you're not using, by the time you actually come into code review, make sure you've cleaned that up. Comments are great, always helpful because they help you and I have a better conversation about your code itself. And then I had a different one for my review, right? Because this is JavaScript code that is both going to use the functions, but also has some unique functionality just for saving the review into, it calls local storage and it passes that in there. Let's see, I'm just looking at the way it's done that. If there's a review, if not, push it and then save game review. So I ended up writing a different function to save game review. And I bet even that is probably a candidate for dry. I probably could have used the same one, just passed it in a key. Anyway, you get the idea. So, again, the goal this week, I don't really have any. I really debate whether I want to do this. And I know this is a little longer than normal, but I really decided rather than, which by the way, I'm not giving you a coding job this week, but if I was you, I would definitely be working on my DevOne because these questions is really trying to help you start thinking about that, right? So in addition to the questions like what will be the inputs you get from the user? How will you handle the user interface? Again, you look at my code if you want to see how I did that. But the short answer is it's pretty simple. Actually, I ended up setting up an error area for error. And then if based on the condition, like if I go in here and I look, right? Actually, I handled it on each event listener. I said if player was equal to, and I could have put null here, but I just put empty string, right? As I responded by updating the text content of that, I just said that error. Else, I just went ahead and played the game. But I also updated the player name event listener with input as soon as you get into that. So in other words, I clear that field or that place in the DOM if they just click into there. So that's how I handle it. So what will you store into local storage? What data will you allow them to edit? What other JS functionality we're going to implement? And your thoughts or questions, right, from viewing my example project. So I want you to think about, and if it was me, I'm going to say this again, I would actually work on this because the sooner you work on it, the sooner you can come get help with it, the sooner you and I can make sure you're in a good position because at week 9, and I promise to end with this, right? You can see we're actually going to have this right before we head out, right? So we're at week 9. I love how Canvas does that. We're at week 9. You have 10, 11, and then 12, right? So that's why I'm doing it this week because, and not only that, what you're learning in the boot camp is actually most of what you're going to be doing for your Dev 0. So it's or Dev 1. It's a perfect time to talk about it. Okay, enough from me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.